Welcome to Reddit Aliens. What crazy person from history was right all along? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Anyone prior to Louis Pasteur who advocated for germ theory, people like Ignaz Semmelweis, were openly mocked for suggestions that doctors should wash their hands before assisting with a birth, as he noted that maternal death was significantly lower when midwives washed their hands. He died in an asylum after suffering a nervous breakdown, and was only vindicated decades after his death when Pasteur and his contemporaries' work on germ theory gained traction over the prevailing miasma theory. Diseases and infections were caused by bad air. Hemingway talked about the FBI following him prior to his suicide. They thought he was paranoid. Decades later, some papers get released. Turns out the FBI was following him. John Linden told a BBC interviewer in 1978 that Jimmy Savile was into all kinds of seediness, and that the BBC probably wouldn't air him saying that. He was right on both accounts. Margaret Dunbar. Her 4-year-old son went missing, and one day the cops found him and brought him home. Except it wasn't her son, and everyone tried to gaslight her into believing it was. Well, she was right, and no one knows what happened to the real Bobby Dunbar to this day. Lord Kitchener. Horatio Herbert Kitchener, Secretary State of War for the British Army. At the onset of World War I, everyone thought the war would end very quickly, either going one way or the other. Kitchener was one of the few people to envision a long war and to prepare accordingly, even though the British government actively hampered many of his efforts, even though he was a war hero. I don't think people labeled him as crazy, but Johnny Rotten, the interview where he called out Savile and was swiftly banned from future BBC appearances, his interview with Piers Morgan years later, and the vindication he clearly feels is a beautiful thing to see. As an American, I was a little late to this story, but after seeing the Johnny Rotten interview and then discovering what happened, it's pretty great and damning for the BBC. Rutherford B. Hayes, not necessarily viewed as crazy, but largely viewed as a bad or useless president. This is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people no longer. It is a government of corporations, by corporations, and for corporations. Said that in the late 1800s. Not bad, man. I don't know that guy's name, but he basically from 1541 to 1542 traveled across South America, the first European to do so. While he was on his journey, he said he saw millions of people and large cities with a lot of life in them, where today is the Amazon rainforest. After he had finished his journey, he had told the stories of those cities, and about 100 years later, when explorers visited the place, there was nothing. No cities, no people, just jungle. So they thought he made it all up. But modern technology has shown that there might have actually been a lot of cities there, and that those people died out with smallpox, and all cities were covered by the jungle within the course of 50 years. So basically, people thought he was crazy and made everything up, but in modern times, it's proven that he was right all along. Alfred Wegener figured out continental drift in 1912, but nobody would buy it until research in oceanography and geology proved it in the early 1960s. Ignaz Semmelweis. He pioneered hand-washing at a time where the medical professionals were in favor of the four humors theory. He was essentially laughed out of the field of medicine and died in an institution. Martha Mitchell. She was like part of the reason why it was discovered that Nixon was involved in Watergate. Her husband was part of the Nixon group, so she got some inside details. When she wanted to tell the news about the whole scandal, her husband and Nixon men put her in a hotel and restrained her from having any contact with anyone. She was seen as an insane person. Her husband and Nixon's men even managed to convince the psychiatrists that she was out of her mind. Actually, there's a phenomenon in psychology which was named after her, aka the Martha Mitchell effect. The single scientist who didn't believe the sugar industry's research that demonized fats. Till his death, he's adamant that fats weren't the cause of obesity and heart attacks. John Yudkin. Jose Canseco named several MLB players who were doping and talked about how prevalent it was, and nobody wanted to believe him because he himself was taking steroids. Quintessential case of you're an asshole, but you're not wrong. Sinead O'Connor, jeopardizing and ruining her career by forcing a spotlight on the Catholic Church protecting pedophile priests. Courtney Love, she tried to warn us about Weinstein. Guy in Victorian England, who found there were more infant deaths from births carried out by doctors than midwives because he found midwives washed their hands and the doctors did not, was dismissed at the time. The lady who sued McDonald's for hot coffee. Everyone treated her like some ridiculous entitled Karen, but she was 80 and the coffee was so hot the skin on her legs fused together and she was hospitalized. She wasn't crazy at all. Eisenhower, re the military-industrial complex. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. All right, you are. If you haven't already read about Eisenhower's thoughts on this, you can go on YouTube and search his exit speech from 1960 if you want to hear the whole. It's like 14 or 15 minutes long. Definitely recommended, and he was spot on. Democritus. Everyone said his theory was wrong about the atomic theory of the universe. Aristotle said everything is made of 4 elements: earth, water, air, and fire. Guess he saw Avatar early, but then years upon years later, Lucretius revived the atomic theory. Gregor Mendel. He invented modern-day genetics, but people back when he was alive, close to 1890s, thought he was wrong, only to be proven way later on. I found out about this in my 7th grade science class a while back. More mythology than history, but Cassandra of Troy, literally cursed to speak true and accurate prophecies all the time, but have no one believe her. Heinrich Schliemann. He 100% believed that ancient Troy had really existed, so he armed himself with a copy of the Iliad and actually managed to find and excavate the city. He'd told everyone and their sister that Troy was a real place, and 40 years before he found it, and everyone thought he was cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. Not so much, it turns out. John Brown was seen as a radical, but he knew that the United States would never give up the institution of slavery without bloodshed. Christine Collins, 1930s Los Angeles, single mother, husband in prison, young son goes to the movies one day and never comes home, goes to the LA cops who had recently very publicly bungled a high-profile kidnapping case resulting in a dead kid. No evidence, no clues, no witnesses, cold case. Until months later, she gets a call. Her kid has been found alive in Illinois. Goes there for a public reunion in front of the press and LA cops. Only she says, "This isn't my kid." Cop says it's been 5 months of trauma. Kid change a lot. Take him home. Publicly pressured by police and reporters. She does. Evidence mounts. It's not her kid. She raises a stink. The police put her in a mental institution and accuse her of trying to dump her child. The child has been sent to juvie. There, another child comes forward and says he was an unwilling accessory to the abduction and murder of her real child by his uncle, a serial killer with 20 child victims. Yet another major black eye for the LA police. She finds allies and eventually ekes out a minor victory. She wins her court case and the central detective loses his job. By the way, the fake child had heard about her case and wanted to go to LA, so he lied. I would not say he was crazy, but Talleyrand, Napoleon's foreign ministry, is seen as a despicable, vicious, two-faced man for plotting against Napoleon more or less openly with enemy nations. He was shockingly right about many things when it came to the future dynamics of geopolitics in Europe. In the middle of the Napoleonic Wars, he thought England, France, Austria, and Prussia were destined to enter an alliance based on common trade and liberalism. Understand economic liberalism, not let's legalize weed liberalism. And as long as it did not happen, there would be constant war in Europe. That's literally Franco-Prussian War, 2 world wars, and EU foreseen back in the early 1800s. He also thought that Russia was an insanely unreliable partner that would always bring trouble to Europe, and that Napoleon was insane for trying to pursue an alliance with them. Talleyrand successfully sabotaged the alliance talks between Napoleon and the Tsar by basically playing them against each other. He thought Russia would always be an adversary at best to Central and Western Europe, and instead of warring each other, they should present a united front to Russian expansionism. Reading about him, it's insane how many things he just believed that were proven spot on. Jon Snow was right about the miasma theory being bullshit, and is one of the main reasons you don't have human waste sewage flowing through your street. The other doctors thought he was crazy when he started to talk about contamination causing disease, which led to a high death toll amongst people whose drinking water had been infected by cholera-laced sewage water. TL, DR. Jon Snow knows his shit. No, he knows nothing. Morgan Robertson. In 1898, he published a story about a ship named the Titan, a fictional ship, that sinks after hitting an iceberg. Allegedly, and I can't find any proof of this, it was initially dismissed for being too outlandish. 14 years later, the Titanic sinks in an eerily similar fashion. Robertson dismissed all claims of being psychic and was just familiar with ships of the time and their flaws. There was a guy named Ralph who warned a bunch of returning camp employees to not reopen. It was the summer of 1980, and all but one were killed. Will Rogers, a humorist, when he invented the term trickle-down economics as a joke, stating that this type of economy would just make the rich richer and the poor poorer. And then we actually implemented it and used the term trickle-down, and Will Rogers was right. The rent has gone through the roof, and our salaries have stagnated, and we can't afford the American dream anymore. All the people that said the NSA, CIA was spying on us for years, thanks to Edward Snowden, we now know that were true, and it was so much so that the NSA had built back doors in pretty much every single electronic device that exists, all the way down to the network switch level on Cisco switches and the internet backbone through AT&T network hubs. The fact that there wasn't mass revolt after the information was released kind of blew my mind. The person who discovered penicillin. He was very messy and the mold developed, but noticed the mold stopped other spreading. At the time was shunned, but later on ended up saving millions of lives. The McDonald's hot coffee lawsuit lady is used as an example of our overly litigious culture in America. In reality, her injuries were horrific and required multiple surgeries. The restaurant kept their coffee well above safe temperatures and had been warned before, but McDonald's hired lawyers who worked hard to paint her in a negative light in the court of public opinion. In the early 1800s, Ignaz Semmelweis believed that hand-washing was the best way to prevent infection, but was widely mocked. Even most doctors did not wash their hands before surgery. Okay, we get it, he was important. A third one? No, we're skipping the next one. Ignaz Semmelweis, again, believed there was invisible creatures responsible for infections that led to the deaths of countless people. Noticed there was a direct relation between survival percentages of babies and mothers born to midwife versus babies born with the doctor's help. Realized that doctors went from patient to patient dealing with all sorts of infections and body fluids, and then death with a woman in labor as opposed to midwives who just dealt with the mother, and, as a result, had a higher survival rate. Urged the use of cleaning procedures between patients but was shouted down by the established medical field. He was sent to an insane asylum for his troubles. Okay, are all the relatives of Semmelweis all on this Reddit, all commenting? I don't know if I've ever read a compilation of stories when one in particular was the subject of so many topics, so I don't know. I mean, he did great things, but alright guys, it's gotta be somebody else. Nobody mentioned Alex Jones though, so that's good. Edwin J. Quinby, a mid-century crackpot and conspiracy theorist who was instrumental in revealing that General Motors, Firestone Tires, and Standard Oil, among others, were using a shell company called National City Lines, originally a Midwestern bus line, to systematically buy insolvent or failing streetcar systems and convert them to buses. Nobody believed it was happening until he reported on it and had the Great American Streetcar Conspiracy seen to by the Supreme Court. While he failed to get all the companies indicted on conspiracy, it did leave a bad taste in the mouths of a lot of people who depended on public rail transit, and also explains why American car-centric culture is what it is today. The Dixie Chicks, Natalie Maines, speaking out against the imminent invasion of Iraq in March 2003. When every other country music singer was thumping their chests, beating the war drum, and jockeying to be the next Lee Greenwood, she spoke up against the coming war and President Bush, and was crucified for it. Boycotted, received death threats from unhinged hillbillies. Turns out she was right the whole time. William Tecumseh Sherman was put on leave by the army and dismissed and ridiculed as a crazy very early on in the US Civil War for saying the Union should prepare for a long and bloody conflict. After a few of the bloodier battles, they decided maybe he wasn't so crazy, and quickly rose to general. Galileo Galilei. He said that the Earth revolved around the sun. He was condemned for being a heretic because he supported the theory of heliocentrism. I remember learning this from Midnight Mass, horror TV series about Ignaz Semmelweis, this guy. He was a pioneer for washing hands in a maternity ward and was laughed at for it. He suffered a mental breakdown and was admitted to an asylum and died shortly after. He must have a lot of fans. Clay Patterson. He was made out to be crazy by giant oil companies because he tested ice cores in the Arctic and figured out that the amount of lead in the atmosphere, the water, and our bodies was extremely high and caused by leaded gasoline. He petitioned Congress for years to make it illegal to add lead to gasoline, but the corporations kept getting him shut down because they used lead as an anti-knock agent for internal combustion engines. Ironically, lead was causing everyone else to go crazy because it is shaped like a neurotransmitter and blocks receptors, causing insanity, similarly to what mercury does, and many employees of the oil companies had gone mad. After decades of battling the oil companies, he finally got his way, and lead was removed from gasoline. Since then, the amount of lead in the atmosphere and in living things has decreased dramatically. Claire Patterson, an effing hero, truly. He also created the first truly clean room. Thank you, Claire. At the height of his tiger blood mania, Charlie Sheen was quoted as saying that he had HIV in the past, but is cured now, and I, like a lot of people, immediately dismissed it as horseshit. Turns out, there is actually medication you can take now that is so effective that you won't even test positive for HIV after a while. Some folks even take it preventatively. Ain't science great?